I'm Dom Nicholls, and this is Ukraine the Latest. Today, we look at some of the ways the war is likely to develop in 2025 and report on Russia's decision to ban cryptocurrency mining to protect its energy grid and charge nightclub attendees for trying to arouse interest in non-traditional sexual relations. How portentous will 2025, the year of the snake in the Chinese calendar denoting a period of upheaval, be for Russia?
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
The first duty of my government is security and defence, to make clear our unshakable support of NATO and with our allies towards Ukraine.
Kyiv stands strong.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Thursday, the 2nd of January, 2025. 2 years and 319 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, I'm joined by the executive editor for audio, Francis Dearnley. I last spoke to you folks on Monday. It was the last live of 2024. Did a bit of a sort of look back then. So Francis and I today, we're going to do, as well as the news and what have you, going to do a brief look forward, any main sort of muscle moves that we expect in 2025. But I'll start with the news. So the head of Ukraine's armed forces, General Alexander Syrsky, he says that Russian forces have suffered 427,000 casualties in 2024. He was actually speaking on Monday, just after we were on air. An analysis by the Institute for the Study of War says that number mostly consists, the area that Russia took in 2024, mostly consists of fields and small settlements in Ukraine and a little bit of Russia, Kursk, and occasional bits of Belgorod. Remember those sort of cross-border raids? They cite geolocated evidence to assess that Russian forces advanced 4,168 square kilometres last year, over half of that coming between September and November. We think those sort of meat assaults in the Donbass that we've been witnessing. Now, that rate of advance has slowed. ISW say that slowed to 18 square kilometres a day in December, for which they suffered an average daily casualty rate of 1,585 personnel. That last statistic coming from Ukraine's general staff, but broadly similar to figures that Western officials are citing. Now, British Defence Intelligence says that Russian casualties now stand at over 760,000. You may remember Russia passed a law in November 2024 that said anyone joining up after December the 1st last year, would have debts written off of up to 10 million rubles. That's just over $94,000 US. That's for the individual and a spouse. Now, the British MOD says that is so that the Kremlin doesn't have to do another round of mobilisation, which is seen as very damaging to public support for the war. Now, the ISW is saying that the Russian military command have likely tolerated these record levels of personnel casualties for such little gain on the ground, especially between September through to November, to facilitate the larger territorial gains, but it remains unclear if the Russian High Command are going to be willing to or able to sustain such casualties if the rate of advance continues to decline. The ISW assessment is that Russia's aim throughout 2024 was to seize the remainder of Donetsk Oblast and establish a buffer zone in northern Kharkiv Oblast. That push, you may remember, over the border in the vicinity of Vovchansk and Lipsky, which went nowhere fast. Now then, Russia starts this year seemingly still relying on very small tactical fighting formations. I'm talking platoon level, so 30-ish soldiers, company of about 100, and very occasionally battalion-size assaults, an infantry battalion, if you like, typically of about 400 or 500 people. Depends on the role, etc., but about that sort of size. So those are very small tactical formations. They are still basically relying on the meat assaults, which is understandable, as in the opinion of Western officials, Russia is just about replenishing in numbers what they're losing at the front. So the number of people they actually get signing up and through what, quote unquote training, very small t training, is what they're losing at the front. The quality of that training, the equipment that people are given, and the leadership is bad and likely declining. Now, Russia is still and will continue to, for 2025, I think, use armoured vehicles, so tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, armoured personnel carriers. The difference between those last two being an armoured personnel carrier is there, sometimes called a battle taxi. It's basically designed to get the soldiers into the fight, whereas an IFV, an infantry fighting vehicle, can actually take part in the fight itself. An APC needs to get the hell out of the way pretty quickly. But even though they're using such vehicles, I think it is a very generous statement to say that Russia is capable now of mounting armoured or even mechanised assaults, an armoured assault being sort of tank heavy, mechanised being just, I'd say, the battle taxis to get you to the fight. Now, if you wanted to have a combined arms assault, that would imply a level of coordination with other units to your left and right, and also other arms of the military, artillery, engineers, air defence, so on and so forth. There's very, very little evidence for that at the moment, and I don't think Russia are going to be able to develop that in 2025. They seem to be using their armoured units just as part of the meat assault, so rushing the tanks at the Ukrainian lines, blasting away, hoping to create a space for the infantry behind to come in and hold. That's not really happening. It's very small, as we say, 18 square kilometres a day across the whole country in December. I mean, it's just woeful and at great cost. Russia's losing lots of vehicles. We've seen them using motorbikes, civilian cars, and so on and so forth. So their priority now, and for the first quarter, I would imagine, at least of this year, the priority seems to be the Donbass. That's the area they've achieved most success in the last year. Pokrovsk and Velika Novosilka, we spoke about regularly. They are still extremely vulnerable, the latter more so, but hardly any movement in the lines over the last few days at all. Drones throughout 2025, especially FPV drones, first-person view drones, still a major threat and will get more so, I think, particularly when both sides work out a way, as they've been developing in the last few months, around the electronic warfare jamming. That's increasingly the case. A lot of drones now, FPV drones, are using fibre optic cabling, spooling out the back of the drone. So if you just fly with remote control, then that radio link, the remote control link, can be jammed, it can be hacked, all the rest of it, and the drone can fly into the ground or do other bits and pieces. But if you've got cable coming out the back through which the pilot is controlling the drone, I mean, it's impossible to interdict, basically. You just have to shoot the thing down. We are seeing that type of drone used increasingly on the front lines. Some of these drones can go up to 10 kilometres. That's a huge distance when you think about where the front lines are in relation to each other. You really don't need much more than that. And if drones are capable of flying, and you've obviously got to keep the fibre optic cable out of the propellers and all that kind of stuff, and not get it snagged and caught in a tree and ripped and all that kind of jazz. But they seem to be managing that, and hence you're getting these drones that are capable of carrying munitions, obviously, as well. That's their primary focus, many kilometres behind the lines. It seems to be the weight of this cable at the moment is about 250 grams a kilometre, so only an extra kilogram for every 4 kilometres you want to try and send these drones. So it's very efficient. The cable itself is very strong and impervious to jamming. So that seems to be the way drones are going to go this year, plus, of course, adding on artificial intelligence in terms of targeting. We've spoken about that before. So the drone itself, even if it loses signal for any reason, if it's jammed or if the cable's cut, the drone knows the difference between a square building and a square tank. It knows what to attack. So I think fibre optic cabling and AI on drones are going to be the way the innovation will go this year. Speaking of drones, briefly, the Ukrainian Navy says it destroyed over 37,000 Russian drones in 2024, the vast majority first-person view. Now, that's just the Navy. As I said, we've started to see drones used much more than just recce and strike. We've seen them bringing down other enemy drones. We've seen them laying mines. We've seen naval drones now a threat to air and aviation, so jets and helicopters. I'll speak about that in a moment. And we've seen ground drones used for logistic resupply, casualty evacuation, as well as strike and recovering downed equipment, so downed drones. So the ground side of drones seems to be relatively immature, as in it's a lot harder. You would not be able to spool a fibre optic cable out the back of a ground drone because it will just get caught on bushes and all the rest of it. But I still think we'll see massive drone innovation throughout the rest of this year. Back to the assessment by the ISW saying that Russian forces, they're assessing that Russian forces need to capture nearly 8,600 square kilometres to seize the remainder of Donetsk Oblast. And that's going to include, or will need to include, significant Ukrainian defensive positions and large cities. Now, They say that Russia would need just over 2 years on the current rate of advance to seize the remainder of Donetsk. And that's assuming that they prioritised it and didn't try to do anything more. Very little chance of that happening the way things are going at the moment. Of course, the great big question is what will happen after Donald Trump comes into power after January the 20th. And I think Francis will be speaking about that a little bit later. Now, a couple of other notable updates since we last spoke live. Ukraine's Military Intelligence Directorate, the GUR, speaking on New Year's Eve, said it had destroyed a Russian Mi-8 HIP helicopter using the Sea Dragon missiles launched from a naval drone, the Magura V5 naval drone in the Black Sea, just off the northwest coast of Crimea. There's not a lot of imagery released online. We're carrying it on our website as well. There were reports yesterday that might have actually been two Mi-8 HIP helicopters destroyed and a third damaged. That, regardless of the numbers, is very significant, I think. A sea drone carrying or destroying a manned and manoeuvring and firing helicopter is very significant. The GUR said at the time they'd brought one down and damaged a second, but it does look like both those numbers have gone up one. Also, around New Year, Ukrainian Special Ops Forces launched drone strikes against the Yavskaya oil depot. That's about 400 km north of Kyiv, continuing their effort there against Russian energy infrastructure. And just in the last couple of days, Russia started 2025, by firing 111 drones at Ukraine overnight on New Year's Eve into January the 1st. 63 were shot down, 46 brought down by EW. 2 people were killed there. A married couple who both worked as scientists. Ihor Zima was a senior researcher and associate professor at the Institute for Biology and Medicine at the Taras Shevchenko National University in Kyiv, and his wife, Alessia Shulka, also worked at the Institute as a deputy director of scientific work. So more civilians killed. Then last night, attacks killed civilians in Kherson, Zaporizhia and Donetsk Oblast. 6 were killed and many others injured. 72 drones targeted 12 oblasts, but all but one were brought down. Okay, more for me later on, but let's turn to the Telegraph's newest employee, our, what we got, the executive editor for audio. Francis, what have you been looking at?
Well, thanks, Dom, and Happy New Year. Wherever you're listening from around the world, it's great to be back with you. 2025 marks the year of the snake in the Chinese calendar, a symbol of upheaval. Interestingly, Russian revolutions of 1905 and 1917, the German invasion of 1941, Stalin's death in 1953, and the start of the Soviet Union's collapse in 1989 all occurred in years of the snake. Now, in 2022, Putin, of course, launched an invasion that has since become the bloodiest war on European soil since the Second World War, unleashing forces that many in the West hadn't seen for a generation. In previous years, in our first episode back, as Dom says, I've tried to offer a broad brush summary of where I think we are and where I think we might be headed on current trajectories. And I'll do the same today, though, as ever, very much welcome your feedback and would emphasise that history never works cleanly based on predictive patterns. Shock, black swan events could upturn everything I'm about to say. But it is still worth making these assessments because it's these kind of calculations that are happening elsewhere which are dictating foreign policy. Now, last year, as in 2023, I argued we were deeper into a war of attrition where each side held onto a definition of victory which they saw as essential to achieve for their own survival. Publicly, both had, in a sense, maximalist objectives. The Ukrainians sought to defeat Russia and to restore the territory Moscow had illegally seized. The Russians sought the elimination of what they called the neo-Nazi leadership in Kyiv and the subjugation of the entirety of the country and its erasure as a sovereign entity. In 2024, I argued that despite the horrors, this remained true, though suggested we might be seeing the first cracks in Western support for Ukraine following the failure of the counteroffensive and war fatigue. But Kyiv stood firm in its objectives regardless. Now, as we enter 2025, I would argue that the cracks have grown and consequently the tone of the conversation has shifted. Discussions of ceasefire and negotiations are rife in Western capitals, with Kyiv being obliged, therefore, to adapt so as not to be seen as trenchant. A large part of this is due, of course, to the election of President Trump in the United States. Europe failed to craft a robust, independent strategy in 2024 that meant less reliance on Washington. Now, Europe's fate and that of Ukraine remains potentially tied to the goodwill of a presidential administration that might try and enforce a peace that is not in Europe's best interests. But such talk around negotiations, which many seem to believe is the most likely scenario in the coming months, are predicated on one massive assumption: that Russia will meaningfully come to the negotiating table in early 2025. There are strong reasons to think that they should, lest we forget that we are seeing a war that was planned as a 3-day special operation turn into a 3-year nightmare. Russia controls just 20% of Ukraine. It's suffered 700,000 casualties. It's been defeated at sea and in the air, depends on North Korea for ammunition, and its defence apparatus at home is also shambolic. Russia has only made minimal progress in its territorial ambitions, struggling to take full control even of Donetsk. Last year's major offensive to establish a buffer zone around Kharkiv barely captured a few kilometres. Attempts to cripple Kyiv by launching missile strikes to induce widespread darkness and destroy energy infrastructure has failed. The financial burden of these failures is significant, with an enormous military budget and 6% allocated for the care of the wounded and compensation for the families of those killed in action. This expenditure, alongside the impact of global sanctions, is exacerbating Russia's already struggling economy. Interest rates have at one point skyrocketed to 23%, and inflation sits at 9%, leading to rising prices for essential goods, including, as our own on-the-ground reporting has shown with James Kilner, staples like bread and butter. Beyond Russia's borders, the conflict has also severely damaged the country's international standing. Putin's earlier involvement in the Syrian civil war helped solidify Assad's regime, but his decision to scale down Russian forces there in order to focus on Ukraine, coupled with the withdrawal of the Wagner Group, weakened its influence in the region. As a result, Moscow's reputation as a reliable ally has been tarnished. Furthermore, Russia's diminished influence in Syria has strained its relationship with Iran, a key regional partner there, as well as a crucial ally to Russia. Should Syria become a haven for jihadists targeting Russian territory, of course, Russia was their great foe for many years, the consequences domestically could also be dire. All the while, the country is becoming more and more dependent on China for economic support due to the impact of sanctions. Only this week, Russian gas shipments to the EU via Ukraine ceased entirely, further deepening Russia's dependence on Beijing. Some have argued that already Moscow is effectively a vassal state as a consequence. So those are the reasons why Putin might be thinking it's in my interest to talk. And yet, he has been in power for 25 years now, a quarter of a century. All dictatorships feel bullish after such an innings, unable to clearly see their own errors. What if the Kremlin, despite these catastrophic losses, calculates that if it continues to wage war and does not meaningfully talk, given Western weakness and division, it is more likely to benefit if it continues fighting? What if it sees part of its strength domestically, at home, as a state, continuing to be built on this ongoing struggle? Given the battlefield dynamics and Moscow's objectives, many convincingly argue, therefore, and this is important, that Putin will continue waging this war for as long as the economy allows him to do so. The Kremlin might posture as conciliatory in January, claiming openness to meaningful talks. Putin is, after all, canny and will likely want to appear reasonable. But what if his proposals are unacceptable to Ukraine and its allies? For America, the choice might be easy: to arm Ukraine further or to pull out entirely and leave it up to Europe. What then for a continent which has failed to prepare adequately for that scenario, and yet cannot agree to terms that would strengthen Moscow's ability to influence the free countries in the east of the continent? This seems to me a question that many diplomats there are unable to convincingly answer. Alternatively, Russia might refuse any concessions outright, leaving Europe unprepared to arm Ukraine independently long term, while Trump withholds support. Or Putin could feign good faith, dragging out negotiations while the war continues, only to offer a terrible deal cede territory with no meaningful security guarantees that Europe or Ukraine could possibly accept. More optimistically, recent geopolitical shifts like the collapse in Syria has emboldened those who argue that dictatorships appear strong until they suddenly crumble. The implications of that are significant, given the man poised to return to the White House, a man who backs winners. Russia's recent defeats may lead him to view Moscow ultimately as a failing power, essentially seeing it as one not worth extending a hand to, especially if its economy enters freefall, as some predict. The best case scenario is that if Moscow refuses to negotiate seriously, the attitude may shift that Kyiv is not a primary obstacle to peace because it's trenchant, but rather it is Moscow that remains unwilling to talk. And that could be the moment that Washington decides to double down on supporting Ukraine, strengthening its leverage on the battlefield and potentially compelling Moscow to negotiate in earnest. That deficit of support could sharply correct itself. But this is the most positive scenario that's likely, and even if it entails a longer, bloodier war to ensure it takes place, that is why it's proven so disastrous for Europe not to demonstrate its capacity, both in moral terms and military terms, to support Ukraine not only to fight, but to potentially win. That would have changed Moscow's calculations. Likewise, it underscores the tragedy of military support becoming a partisan issue in the United States, rather than one that is predicated, if not on morality, then on pure self-interest. Many would argue that on those grounds alone, Europe and the wider West shouldn't be pursuing negotiations, but defeat. When you concede principles, you do ultimately end up conceding territory. That territory isn't just geographic, it's political. Russian disinformation, pumped into the West as toxifying politics, which Moscow uses to try and influence to its own advantage in Europe's so-called grey zones, such as Georgia and Moldova. Sabotage and terrorism has also increased to a point that Western intelligence chiefs have broken cover to say that Moscow is acting as if it is at war with the West. All the while, Russia kidnaps thousands of children from the occupied territories, whilst many seem to assume that any territory that's taken by Russia is lost for good. A rather strange mentality in light of the Second World War, where so many countries fell entirely, but were not considered lost forever. And when we know that the resistance in the occupied territories is still very much active, something I'll come to later on. For me, therefore, to wrap this up, the pathway to meaningful negotiations, which by their very definition requires both sides to be willing to agree concessions, is not yet in place. And it's harmful to the West's cause, Ukraine's cause, however you want to articulate it, for so many countries to be seeing negotiations as inevitable. Instead, it would be in their best interest to be pledging Kyiv more support, seeing negotiations, if they occur, as a potential avenue to end the war, but not the only avenue. To rely on negotiations is to cede the strategic initiative to the aggressor. The year of the snake. The snake teaches us that sometimes silence and sharp, calculated reaction are far more powerful than signposted, limited responses. That sense of urgent unpredictability has been lacking in the West throughout this war. But perhaps 2025, a new year of the snake after all, might be when, faced with certain realities, certain new actors, calculations change and reality bites.
Well, thanks, Francis. When you talk about negotiations, we had this report over Christmas that the Trump team, now this was reported from the US, so we didn't actually get anything official, obviously, but we heard that the Trump team had put together or proposed, floated the idea of some sort of peace deal along the lines of no NATO membership for Ukraine for 20 years and no Western peacekeepers on the ground in Ukraine post any kind of settlement. Well, we heard about it mainly from Lavrov and Putin himself, who rejected that. So we don't actually know what was being floated, but they outright rejected that. But very possibly because both sides now see that they're gaining more by the battlefield than by any negotiations. So you wouldn't expect any kind of meaningful engagement there. But I just thought it was interesting that they so overtly and publicly rebuffed that and named it as from the Trump team. Anyway, we simply don't know. That's the tragic and the great thing about Donald Trump coming in on the 20th of January is that he's Mr. Unpredictable. We just don't know what's going to happen. But then equally, Putin doesn't know what he's going to do. Russia has never negotiated with the West on anything like this scale, I would suggest, since the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. And they've never negotiated with this level with Trump, as I say, Mr. Unpredictable. But what we do think that Trump is much more interested in China, kind of wants to be done with the whole Ukraine thing, wants Europe to take more responsibility, correctly take more responsibility for its own security. So is it wise for Russia to so clearly and overtly just throw back this plan that we're told came from the Trump team, sort of throw it back in his face? Trump might well say, well, I'll tell you what, I just want done with this. I'm going to arm Ukraine to the teeth, and then I'm going to start looking at China. I think it's the way they are already soft negotiating with the incoming Trump administration, I think is very interesting. And I think they're just sticking to tight. They're sticking to what they know, which is demand the maximum, play the victim card, and refuse to take any kind of concessions whatsoever. And I just don't think that's going to work. I don't think that's going to work at all. I do think it's very interesting, the gas deal. So Ukraine shutting off the gas from Russia that has continued to flow into Europe. That's a very interesting move. There's reports that European gas prices have gone up already by just over 4% to 51 euros per megawatt hour, the highest for at least a year and a half, and probably going to go higher. And I think that's interesting because we in the West are now going to see how serious Western leaders are when they say they're going to stick with Ukraine for as long as it takes. We're going to see what for as long as it takes really means here, because they're going to have to explain to us, to the populace, to the consumers, why we should pay more, why we literally should pay more for our power supply, just as winter gets going here because of the Ukraine war. Now, I'm in a lucky position. I'm willing to do so. But that's a conversation that our Western leaders are going to have with the people here. And so there's a number of things happening here that I think make this idea of negotiations and the stance from the West, and of course the whole big Donald Trump at the back of this. It's just such an interesting dynamic, and I think Ukraine has been very clever. Zelensky has been very clever in the way he's courted Trump this time round, especially in the negotiations with Syria and all that kind of stuff. I think they've been quite clever. I think Russia have been somewhat industrial, shall we say, in their diplomacy of just not engaging. I think maybe they're still reeling from the shock of Syria, but they've not been particularly cute in their public pronouncements regarding any kind of negotiations or anything to do with the Trump team. We are guessing, Francis, so we won't over-labour the point. But are you seeing any sign at all of a firmer view of anything that we think Trump might stand on when he comes into power?
Not yet, no. I think we still are very much in a wait-and-see situation. Of course, the appointments have got some people very excited, some more hawkish individuals there as part of the regime, though one could also say that those individuals have proven their loyalty to Donald Trump fundamentally, and it's that he's looking for, and that his calculations could change on a whim, and he's determined that these individuals could carry those out, even if they're not especially hawkish. And yet, as you say, Dom, there is another point here, which is that leverage could be more in the hands of Trump over Russia than over Ukraine. So if we look at the ways in which, if Washington sought to seriously damage Moscow's ability to wage war in Ukraine, it has numerous opportunities, whether it be on sanctions, whether it be on weapons support that could be provided to Ukraine. You name it, America can do it. It has the power to do so. But its leverage over Ukraine specifically and its decisions is quite considerably reduced given the amount of material that's been pumped in by President Biden in the last months of his administration. And indeed, we're seeing that with the way that Ukraine has prepared itself, as it were, for 2025, that it's saying it would be able to wage war at the current level at least 6 months into 2025, perhaps longer. That weakens Trump's ability to potentially strong-arm Ukraine into certain scenarios. Certainly not in the long term, but in the short term. And I should say that I'm focusing very much in those remarks a moment ago in the short term. It seems to me that there is a mentality at the moment that negotiations are going to begin in late January, early February, and we might be seriously talking about a peace deal that is meaningful come March. As I said earlier on, I do not see that as being the most likely scenario as things stand, given where we are. And given all of that and the leverage point, it may well be that because Trump doesn't want to be thinking about Ukraine any longer, that the short-term solution to Ukraine is to arm Ukraine more and compel Moscow to negotiate meaningfully. But again, we're a long way, I think, from that being seen as likely. We're several moves on the chessboard, as it were, away from that being the most likely scenario. But nonetheless, I think it's an important one. But I was going to ask you, Dom, I mean, looking at the military situation at the moment, do you think it is likely that the, say, North Korean presence will be any significant military factor in early 2025? Or from what we've seen, is it yet more fodder, as it were, for the guns, and that realistically the support that North Korea is providing that is meaningful is in terms of the ammunition? Like, have we really seen a profound change on the battlefield calculations as a result of those 10,000 North Korean troops coming in?
No, is the short answer. They've not done much at all. I think it is the materiel side, the provision of ammunition and howitzers in particular, rather than the manpower. No, the North Korean soldiers have been found to be, I mean, they've sort of taken the meat assault as a sort of tactic of par excellence rather than a sort of desperate measure. They really haven't done anything. The numbers are, as you say, we think about 10,000-ish. The lines in Kursk have shifted a bit, but not much at all. And so no, it's been a political intervention. I can't see that stopping. And if we're talking about the numbers of casualties, circa 15 to 1,800 a day that Russia's taking, then if they are coming from North Korea, Putin will be happy with that. But no, they really haven't done anything on the battlefield. That's a question of can Ukraine keep going? Has it got the personnel to keep going? And as I said at my sort of end of year look back a few days ago, that is an area of concern about the numbers of people in the Ukrainian armed forces and their mobilization plan. Are they going to reduce the age of mobilization from 25? No sign of that at the moment. Well, the other thing, of course, is that those soldiers holding the line up in Kursk and elsewhere need the ammunition to, without putting too fine a point on it, flat pack the North Korean furniture, shall we say. So no, it's not really done much at all there. I don't think it will do much. There are just so many corners being backed into at the moment. Trump has kind of made a corner for himself when he did the whole "we're going to sort the war out in a day." Those words are going to come back to him in a few weeks' time, and we don't know which way he'll go after that. Equally, the utter irreconcilable mantra that we get from Putin about his maximalist aims still, and it's Nazis and drug dealers and all the rest of it against what's happening on the front. And somebody eventually is going to say, well, look, you go on about NATO heading eastwards and gobbling up all these countries as if they've got absolutely no agency whatsoever. Someone's going to point out to him that, if NATO is this rampant, aggressive, territorially hungry, omnipotent beast, you've got a big problem here, pal, because you've got a totally undefended border with Finland. You've burnt your ground army in Ukraine. So if NATO wants to walk in, it pretty much can. And if not you, then maybe Belarus. And would you, Russia, go to nuclear war with NATO over Belarus? These are all hypotheticals, I think, but somebody's going to point them out eventually, or rather, maybe a lot of people in the Russian society will start asking these questions and thinking, my God, the emperor's got no clothes. Francis, we will continue this chat through the year, but a lot of people making some pretty big statements at the moment, and they can't all be right, is what I would say. Any more thoughts, Francis, before I turn to final thoughts?
Well, I think just one, Dom, which is that, of course, the other angle of all of this, which is being perhaps underexplored, is just the extent of the human cost of this. I'm always very, very struck that when diplomats are talking about the Ukraine issue, it seems to be always in the frame of military and political priorities. And of course, that makes sense in many other ways. But I think that really the sense of moral outrage that should still be very much in place, if not more so, has to a certain extent been lost or at least eroded over the past 3 years. And this is always the danger with war, is that you, in a sense, adapt to it and your moral universe changes. The fact is, we now know so much more about what has been going on in the occupied territories than we knew months into the war, even a year into the war. And yet it seems to me that many politicians who quite openly talk about the idea of negotiations which might see territory ceded do not really know what that means for the individuals who live in that territory. And of course, over the Christmas period, we broadcast several interviews from our time in Kharkiv where we spoke to people who lived in the occupied territories, who lived under, indeed in the case of one lady, under the Russian heel for weeks. And the horrors that they endured are really so egregious in the 21st century context, indeed in any context, I would argue, that this should be something that is very much at the forefront of our minds. And so when politicians talk freely and liberally about the idea of a good peace, a lasting peace that involves negotiations and territory ceded, I think really it should be on the onus of all of us to make sure that they are aware what that really means, and so that they at the very least need to be able to articulate why they think that it is worth signing people's lives away to such horrors for the good of the continent. And if they can't make a convincing argument for that, that really all that they're trying to do is end a war that is expensive and bloody, then I would say that it is not really good enough in moral terms, if nothing else. So I think that's another aspect of the war that should be on the forefront of our minds and yet really isn't. And I think that was clear again over the Christmas period, with not masses of reflections, as you were talking about, Dom, on the 30th, by our world leaders to be talking about the moral outrage that is continuing to take place all of the time as a consequence of Russia's invasion.
Okay, let's now move to final thoughts. I've got a couple for you, Francis, if I may. I note with interest, Russia has banned crypto mining in 10 regions of the country. So this comes from the state media outlet RT, formerly Russia Today. They're reporting that regions, including southern areas bordering Georgia, such as Dagestan, Ingushetia, North Ossetia and Chechnya, but also what RT call the new Russian regions of Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia and Kherson. Someone's going to have to actually have a word with them, tell them they don't hold all that land. They're saying that crypto mining's been banned there from yesterday to March the 15th. Oh, hang on. No, March the 15th, 2031. It's very, very specific, a long-term plan, this. Now, last year, you may remember Putin signed legislation legalizing cryptocurrency mining, but that activity is hugely power hungry. And the Russian energy grid is apparently just not up to it. Almost as if his energy officials hadn't been telling him the truth about how good the infrastructure was and whether it could actually handle all the mining when he called for such things just a few months ago. Anyway, RT, of course, said nothing of that and said the ban was part of, quote, broader efforts to manage energy resources efficiently and address power shortages while accommodating industrial requirements. I think that's shorthand for our energy grid is woeful. The loss of the European business means the heavily subsidised domestic market is up the Swanee, and all these Ukrainian drone attacks aren't helping. But very interesting, I thought there, that crypto mining so soon after being announced, with not a huge amount of fanfare, but Putin said it, and then just a few months later they're having to ban it. Thoughts on that, folks? I mean, I'm right on the edge of my jigsaw here when it comes to crypto mining. I'm aware that it's incredibly power hungry. Do you think that is the reason? Is that because the energy infrastructure is so poor? Is that one of the reasons, or the main reason why it's been banned? Please let us know. And the last one for me, Francis, I've worked out why I've been sanctioned by Russia. I can't talk for you as well, but I've worked out why I've been sanctioned. I note that Russia has fined 7 people for, quote, looking too gay, unquote, after a police raid on a nightclub last February in Tula. That's a town or city about 100k south of Moscow. Now, police charged these detainees with, quote, trying to arouse interest in non-traditional sexual relations. That's been a crime since 2013 after what's currently or commonly referred to as Russia's anti-gay law, although that is usually directed at anyone publishing pro-LGBT material, not just for an individual's choice of clothing. But independent news site Verstka, they've done some analysis on court records that show of this group of people. One man was held for having crosses of black tape glued to his nipples and a women's style corset on his naked body. Another person had, another person had pink socks and an unbuttoned kimono over his shoulders. His hair was dyed bright orange and red tattoos on his face. Now, the court description read, although a man, he was wearing a short top covering his chest, black leather shorts above the knee on which there were several chain-shaped ornaments and fishnet tights. Judges are reported to have said the appearance of the detainees is inconsistent with the image of a man of traditional sexual orientation. I mean, it's just, it would be laughable if it wasn't so serious. I mean, this is backward. I mean, what's going on in this country? But anyway, why me? Why have I been sanctioned? Well, Francis, probably because someone's found the photos of me at the fancy dress party when I went as a roller skating bunny girl waitress wearing a black satin corset with fishnet stockings. One of my finest moments, I think. The dressing up box came up trumps that night. Anyway, I just thought that was just so stupid. And but God, is that where the country is? Anyway, Francis, final thoughts, please.
Well, thanks, Dom. It might be time to dust off that costume because Eurovision is coming up. We're in 2025, after all. It's not too far away. But I want to end with another tragically absurd policy coming out of Moscow. And this is being reported by Ukraine's National Resistance Centre. They're saying that Russian authorities in the occupied territories have banned any mention of St. Nicholas in educational institutions. To quote them, they say the administrations of preschools and educational institutions in the occupied territories of Ukraine have been instructed to ban even the mention of St. Nicholas. At all events, only Grandfather Frost and the Snow Maiden, traditional Russian characters, must be present. In addition, a complete ban on carols and nativity scenes have been introduced. The invaders recently held preventative discussions with the children to discredit Santa and other fairy tale figures from Western cultures. I mean, it's a sort of behaviour, as shocking as it is, that we've come, of course, to expect from Russia, but not only in this war, but indeed over the course of the 20th century. I think it's a little known fact that Christmas as a religious holiday, I think I'm right in saying, was officially banned in 1929 as part of the Soviet efforts to stamp out religion and religious influences. The state was to be, of course, all-powerful, and anything that might be considered a threat to that, as well as being seen as backward and not progressive, was to be destroyed. And so if you read books of accounts of people who grew up in the Soviet Union, particularly around the 1920s, 1930s, this was very, very common. Churches were being destroyed, traditions being eradicated, and indeed, of course, what was most vicious was the erasure of local customs in those countries that were not originally part of, let's say, central Russia, but were on the periphery and are now since become their own independent countries. But now, as then, I would argue that any attempts to eradicate Santa in the occupied territories will fail. And indeed, as we see across Europe, that in those territories that were formerly the Soviet Union, Christmas is very much alive and kicking despite the state's best efforts. So perhaps a little bit of optimism in which to start 2025.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Nicholls. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our foreign affairs newsletter, bringing stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine Live blog on our website where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on X so that you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload, so if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it's released, do refer to podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Phil Atkins. Executive producers are Louisa Wells and David Knowles.